मौत नाल सिद्धा हो मौत नाल सिद्धा नाता जोड़िया शहीदां ने रहना है आजाद सदा
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you to everyone who's joined us for another discussion brought to you by the Panth-Punjab project. The Panth-Punjab project is a collective platform for a new generation to analyze the context we exist in and map out the networks of power mobilized against us so that we can mark the signposts on our path towards collective liberation. Currently, we have 4 parts to our ongoing discussions where we've been inviting various guests from all over the world to speak to these important subjects. This is our first discussion in our series of discussions where we will be looking at building solidarity, and these series of discussions are called Towards Liberation. We began with conversations around the siege of Delhi, and then our conversation moved towards rising Punjab and this idea of Chardi Kala. And we also have been speaking about the annihilation of caste, and we will be revisiting these individual series as our conversation and our collective struggle takes different turns. Today we're joined by Professor Ather Zia, and we will be speaking about the struggle in Kashmir. And Kashmir is globally acknowledged as one of the most militarized zones in the world. And Kashmir represents one of the clearest examples of Indian imperialism and state violence. Beyond this limited picture, however, the tenacity and vibrance of Kashmiri resistance carries countless lessons for struggles around the world. And today, through speaking with Professor Ather Zia, a Kashmiri political anthropologist, poet, a short fiction writer and columnist, we want to understand the occupation of Kashmir as well as the mass resistance to Indian imperialism. And we will focus on exploring the possibilities of building a true intersectional solidarity across the region to move towards the collective liberation of the peoples of the subcontinent. And I pass over to Veer Gurnishan Singh, who will introduce our guest for today.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. As Shamsher Veer has mentioned, our speaker for today is Professor Ather Zia, and she is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She is an associate professor of anthropology and gender studies at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Ather is the author of Existing Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, and co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and a distillation called Peace. She's published a poetry collection, The Frame, and another collection which is forthcoming in 2021. Ather's ethnographic poetry of Kashmir has won an award from the Society of Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is a co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. And Before we get today's discussion going, Professor Ather, we wanted to request to see if we could get if you could give our viewers a bit of a background and some context on the roots of resistance in Kashmir. What are some of the key moments and issues of conflict, and what do they tell us about the nature and character of the Indian imperialism?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shamsher, Gurnishan, and Panth-Punjab for inviting me and for that introduction as well. I think this is such an important moment in the conversations that we've been having to see the overlaps and collaborations of discourse that we can have to understand the nature of Indian imperialism, which has been hidden for so long that it's very hard to convince the rest of the world that there is neo-imperialism, that there is neo-colonialism that has been happening right from the inception. And it has a bearing on peoples from Kashmir to Punjab and also beyond, like looking at the heartland of India right now with the kind of what they call as guerrilla insurgencies happening. So I think all of these are connected and we need to have a conversation on that. And just talking quickly about, do I have 10 minutes to sum up and give the update? So the key moments I would say for us to understand, and for those of you who are in the audience and do not know much about Kashmir, I would say that we have to start shifting our lens. And the reason I'm saying we have to start shifting our lens is that we try to understand each problem happening inside India. And for lack of a better frame, like inside India, by inside India, I mean the states that have been even forcibly integrated with it. We usually use the lens of democracy, and then we look through that. And I think people who look at Punjab, who have experienced Punjab, who have experienced Kashmir, would urge the rest of the world to really shift lenses and start looking at India as a neo-colonial power. I know it's very hard. From 1947 onwards, because of the Nehruvian ideology, which was really permeating India for the first, let's say, a decade, it's kind of seen as this post-colonial nation which has been fighting a resistance for like long years against the British rule, and then the kind of nation that they tried to create, which was based on these secular ideals. But we all know how secular it was. It was never, I mean, Gandhi was killed the moment, and Gandhi, for all his shortcomings and all the obfuscations that are around his person and that are also coming off right now, I feel his assassination also has a lot of lessons for the kind of India that was already in formation in that present moment. So thinking about Kashmir, what are the key moments? I would say, let's think about 1947 and not think that Kashmir was created in 1947 as a dispute. So for that, our frame should shift to 1931. In 1931, 13 July, what happened inside Kashmir was that there was an uprising. There was people rebelling on the streets. They were protesting. And then 22 Kashmiris were killed who were fighting to unseat the monarchy at that time. And the monarchy at that time was by this warlord group, the Dogras. They were ruling Kashmir, and that they had British paramountcy on them. So which means Kashmiris were ruled twice. One was by the Dogra warlords, and the second was the British who were sitting upon them, upon the Dogra warlords. So the reason I'm asking us to think about 1947 not as the starting point, but 1931, is that will give us an understanding that Kashmir is not a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. There is a third party to the dispute, which is the most important stakeholders, and that is the Kashmiris themselves, who have been looking for sovereignty. At that time, they were talking about ousting the Dogra ruler, but they were also talking about having some sort of a constitutional democracy, where the monarch would be something like what happens in Britain at this present moment. You have the monarchy intact in some ways. So trying to figure out how is it that the society can be made more egalitarian, because it was a monarchical rule, and it was a very despotic rule in which the majority of the Muslim population, they were on the receiving end of the very tyrannical laws that were in place. So that's one key moment that I would ask our international audience, people who are newly interested in Kashmir and have not known much, but are seeing Kashmir through the perspective of what India has for the last 72 years planted in the international conscience. And that's a couple of things. One, that India is the largest democracy and it's a secular nation. And I think we have to look past that. India in Kashmir is playing politics of democracy. It has weaponized democracy. It has utilized the tools of electoral politics to tell the rest of the world that Kashmiris are taking part in elections. That's democracy. But that's not true. We have to understand the nature of that electoral democracy. Like, how did it even begin? So that's one frame shifting we have to understand. We have to start taking into cognizance. And then there are other the other key moment for me personally is 1971. 1971, why? That's because we had the Shimla agreement happening between India and Pakistan that technically ended the Kashmiri movement for plebiscite. Because now it became a problem, it became an India-Pakistan problem. If you see the historically, Kashmir is registered as a Kashmir question on the UN agenda. It later on became an Indo-Pak issue. Before that, it started as a Kashmir question because Kashmir was a principality of its own, just like Punjab was, just like the 750 states in the kingdoms in and princely states in British India were. So the other key moment for me is 1971 because a pact happened between India and Pakistan, and that pact actually was almost like the line of control, which is now demarcating the two Kashmirs, one that is administered by Pakistan but is also independent, and the other side, which is the Indian-controlled Kashmir. The line was called ceasefire line till 1971, which meant that there was a war that was at halt. That was converted, that nomenclature was converted to line of control. And it technically, to a lot of Kashmiris, it meant that that part is with Pakistan, stays with Pakistan. It's some kind of a truce between the two countries. And Kashmiri voices were essentially sidelined with the change of that nomenclature and with the kind of, but one thing that they did at that time was that no country is going to unilaterally change the status of Kashmir. That is part of that Shimla agreement. So for me, that stands out as a key moment because that really essentially criminalized any movement for plebiscite, any movement for independence. After that, you kind of see the thrust towards any kind of, all kinds of repression happening inside Kashmir, initially through taking out the voices that were speaking for plebiscite, but later on, it kind of becomes that anyone speaking for resistance, it doesn't even exist after 1971. It starts receding and receding and receding. And people think that a lot of Indian narrative talks about that time as maybe Kashmiris coming to terms with the fact that that they probably will integrate with India. But that is not, that's a cosmetic piece that was there till 1984 and then 1989 when the movement blew up in armed struggle, so to speak. So the third key moment is 1989 when the armed resistance actually began. A lot of people like to think, especially in India, they like to think, okay, because there was this one party that wanted to fight elections. It was called Muslim United Front. These were people who actually had been politically delegitimized for many, many years, and they couldn't speak about independence. They couldn't speak about plebiscite. So they didn't have any platform because everything was criminalized. So they decided to fight elections. But because the nature of elections in Kashmir has always been rigged towards client politicians who side with India, this party was routed. But routed not because people didn't vote for it, but because the elections were rigged as usual. And then these people were actually put in jails. And a lot of people in India, they think democracy wasn't given a chance. That's why militancy or the armed struggle broke out. But I would like to bring the audience's attention to the fact that it wasn't because democracy wasn't given a chance. It was because democracy never existed inside Kashmir. The voting or the elections that were happening in Kashmir are illicit from the very get-go. Because in 1951, when a client politician entered into a truce with India and established the special status that, and I like to call that person a client politician for lack of a better word, to make people understand that these were people who were already in cahoots with India. They were siding with India, and they were Kashmiris. There was a section of Kashmiris, a political party that heavily sided with India at that time, but it was all predicated on the plebiscite, which never happened. And that election, the first election that happens in 1951, United Nations asks India, like, how is it that you can hold elections in a disputed territory? And India says that this is only for governance. The plebiscite is still on the table. So that's the beginning of, quote unquote, the electoral democracy inside Kashmir. And in 1987, we see it kind of completely annihilated because of the Muslim United Front, they being routed, they being arrested, and then some people being killed. So when I talked to people who took part in that elections, I said, was it because democracy wasn't given a chance, which is what Indians say? They say, no, it's not democracy wasn't given a chance. As I said, the democracy never existed. They were just trying to find a way to speak about Kashmir's independence and plebiscite movement. And they thought that it would be, the only way was to talk in the assembly, because other forms of resistance were already delegitimized and criminalized. So that's another 1987 to 1989. And the other key moment is 2019, when you don't have a nominally secular party in place, but you have the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is connected to RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is one of the largest militia in the world, and is also based on the ideology of Nazism and fascism and Hindu supremacy, basically. And they want to make India without any, they very bare bones talk about India being a Hindu nation, and without holding any, they don't pretend to be secular. They're telling the world what they want, and they're going for it. And they're also using some technical language and some politically correct language here and there. But in 29, what they did was they completely removed Kashmir's autonomy unilaterally. Now, even if I was not to believe in the Shimla Agreement 1971, it still is illegal for them to do this, because this is a state under dispute. So they not only removed the autonomy, they also bifurcated the state into two. And then they not only did that, they also converted the state into a union territory, which means that now it's directly ruled by New Delhi. And once they did that, what were they trying to achieve? Here we have to understand that in 1949, the client politicians, they got into this agreement with India to get a quasi-autonomy for Kashmir. They wanted India, even though they were client politicians, they still wanted India to identify them as a unique people, as a nationality, so to speak, even if they were client politicians. So they did the Article 370, which was part of the Indian Constitution, that Kashmir is going to be an autonomous unit. Only defense, currency, and foreign affairs are going to be handled by India. So initially, Kashmir started as having its own prime minister and its own president, which was taken away in 60s. So India has been, whether secular governments or not, India has been constantly in every phase and every decade eroding that autonomy, which they completely took away in 2019. And then through the people inside this big communication blackout, there was no internet, there was no phone, there was curfew, and it lasted months. Because they feared that people are going to protest and people are going to, just rebel against what's being done. And they also flew in extra army, 50,000 troops, plus the 650,000 troops that are already inside Kashmir. So you see the heavy militarization. So 2019 is another watershed mark. And it's also very scary because now Kashmir also had another ruling and a statute that protected the indigenous people's rights and Kashmiri citizens' rights, who are called state subjects. It was the territorial sovereignty. It was the Article 35A, which gave Kashmir territorial sovereignty, which meant that Indian citizens could not become citizens inside Kashmir. They were not Kashmiri state subjects. And they could not have right to franchise and right to property, which did not mean that there was not business happening and people were not residing inside Kashmir, but they did not have the same rights as Kashmiris. Now in 2019, that's been completely taken away. The domicile law has been changed. And now there are very strong policies being put into place where there is brazen settler colonialism on rise inside Kashmir, which means that India really wants Indians to settle inside Kashmir as settlers, get the domicile. So in the last 2 years, I think more than 16 lakh applications have already happened. And Kashmiris are really fearing a dispossession, and they are thinking that they are going the Palestinian way. And there are going to be settler colonies, which are already established in different ways under different names. So that's where we are at the moment. But I would really insist that we start shifting our lenses, especially for India. And that then everything makes sense. Punjab makes sense. The farmers' protest makes sense also when we think about neo-colonialism. And also the lens of neoliberalism also helps us understand the kind of new imperial state that India is at the moment. And that's why we need solidarity and these conversations to look at those channels of power that are holding us down. So that's where I'll end. I think I surpassed the time.
Thank you so much, for your clarity. And every time I speak to somebody from Kashmir, and I know Gurnishan will echo this, and so will so many of our viewers, the parallels that are drawn between our struggles that are painful to hear, because it just reminds us of our own subjugation under this so-called democratic country that is now known as India. And I hear you with this idea of framing, and you are very particular with your language, and that's something that we appreciate at the Panth-Punjab project. If we look at this process of so-called partition, this colonial legal mechanism that was utilized, and we see the Congress's insistence on a centralized political structure, rejecting any minority that doesn't conform to this fabricated notion of being Indian. And it labels these identities as communal. And this celebration of Kashmir joining the so-called republic is seen as a symbol in itself of democracy and secularism, especially under Nehru. Can you talk about how Hindutva and Indian nation building and state building have been intertwined since 1947? Mm-hmm. And how is Hindutva related to Indian nationalism itself? Mm-hmm. And what does that relationship, and what relationship does it have with the liberal secular brand of the Congress on one hand, and the BJP Sanghi fascism on the other?
Oh, that's a very ambitious question. I'll try to answer some parts of it and hope it comes together. So the first thing that I would want to think about is the Kashmir situation itself from 1947 itself. Like what's been made visible and what's been made invisible. So one of the things that you will hear a lot about Kashmir is Kashmiriyat. It's a word that really makes its entry after 1947 inside the political firmament inside Kashmir. And a lot of client politicians, they use this word to show how secular Kashmir is, how syncretic its culture is. Because, and the reason I start with this answer is, start with Kashmiriyat is because you want to box that. That's been really, really played up regarding Kashmir, as if Kashmir did not have any communal history. And I think that in itself is invisibilizing a lot of things. So let's keep that on our radar. And the other thing that I want to talk about is 1947 itself. There is this huge myth around that Gandhi came to Kashmir and then said, oh, I have seen the best communal harmony here, and this is the promise of whatever. Because we have to remember that even before the negotiations of 1947, Indian diplomats or Indian politicians, they were already in conversation with a lot of Kashmiris, kind of like trying to get them on their side, because they kind of were dissuading them from the idea of Pakistan, which was also emerging and which was also Kashmiris, a large section of Kashmiris, they want to accede to Pakistan. In fact, there is one organization, a fighter organization, that's the only one, indigenous one at this present moment, active, which wants to accede to Pakistan. And then most Kashmiris are united in one thing, that they hate India. There is a strong anti-India sentiment. But another thing is also true, except for some sections, I'm sure there are people who don't like Pakistan, but most Kashmiris have an affective relation with Pakistan. That has also been invisibilized by India. It's almost as if it's to be thought of like, when you say Pakistan, it's almost like a deviance. There's complete invisibilization of history of Kashmiris with what is now Pakistan, because there was no Pakistan before 1947. And the ruler who was ruling Kashmir at that moment, he actually had more connection with what is now Pakistan, with Karachi, Rawalpindi. His airport was in Karachi, I think. And then the essential supplies came from there. Kashmiris till today, they consider Pakistani salt as the best salt, which is the Himalayan pink salt. It used to come from, because there were no barriers. And what was unnatural was the connection with India, because there are mountains between Kashmir and what is India now. And there was no natural contiguity. So I think what has been happening to us, especially our generation and generation before, there is this historicization of Kashmir as if it existed in a vacuum, as if in 1947, Gandhi saw this ray of hope of communal harmony. But what people forget, what the region was undergoing in 1947, especially after India and Pakistan became two nations. So we will have to kind of, again, go back and plant ourselves in that time. In 1947, we know that the largest partition that the world has ever seen happened inside what was the British India and the princely states. And you, Shamsher, already mentioned about the partition that was imposed on this subcontinent. And then what was Kashmir doing at that time? I think it's very important for us to ask these questions. Like when the partition was happening, which was majorly happening across Punjab, so to speak, what was happening in the rest of India? What were those people thinking? Because India pushes this myth as if everyone wanted to be India. And that is something that we don't grapple with. India really projects this unity in diversity, where this has been a forced unity. And that is still manifest. I think we need to ask those questions. We have taken Indian narrative and we have imbibed it. We do have, if we think, we have an internalized bias towards Indian narrative as well. We have to decolonize ourselves. I think that's the foremost thing, and that's what we're doing in this conversation. And when you speak of like when you talk about like the connection that the Hindutva supremacist forces have already had, let me tell you one thing. No one really, till very recently, talked about the Jammu massacre of Muslims. Jammu was a Muslim majority. Jammu is the other province of Kashmir. Kashmir was 3 provinces, Ladakh, Jammu, and Kashmir Valley. Now, Ladakh is a separate union territory. Jammu is still a province with Kashmir, but it's under a union territory status now. So Jammu was a Muslim majority state in 1947. Today, you have very less Muslims there. I think around 40%. The rest are Hindus. Now, I have no problems with Hindus being the majority, but we have to ask ourselves, like, how did they become a majority post 1947? Because there was a big massacre where 200,000 Muslims were killed. And how were they killed? You had the Dogra ruler at that time, the person who was a despot. What was he doing? And there was also an emergency administration in place in 1947. From August 15, 14 till October 27, Kashmir was an independent state. It was still debating whether to join India, whether to join Pakistan, whether to have an independent status. It still had a standstill agreement with Pakistan so that the essential supplies could keep coming. And India had refused to sign the standstill agreement because it was arrogantly saying that, it's ours. And you also have to understand that this was a Muslim majority state and the ruler was a Hindu. What did he want to do? He actually wanted to stay independent mostly. But then how did he really get influence towards India? That has to be understood. And there is a lot of Hindutva element in that. So Golwalkar actually comes to Kashmir and he talks to him. And he tells him that he has to join India. And that conversation is actually printed in the RSS. There's a book on RSS, I forget what the name is, but this book sums up their history. And it mentions that it has a chapter on that. And the ruler tells him, how can I join India? My airport is in Karachi. And there's this conversation happening between the two. So we do not see the Hindutva forces that have been at work from the very inception. And then when he influences him fully, you have the RSS militia inside Jammu actually helping, aiding, abetting the pogrom that took place against the Muslims at that time. No one really spoke about that massacre till very recently. It was really, really invisibilized. No one really asked the question, like, why are the Jammu Muslims so scared? They hadn't engaged with their own generational history because such was the repression. So many people at that time, they went to Sialkot because when the communal forces started manifesting in Jammu, and RSS was a big part of that in 1947. Just imagine, it was 6th and 7th and 8th November when this is happening. And by that time, what had also happened on October 27th, the Indian forces had officially landed inside Kashmir to kind of like fight the war that was going on. But at the same time, Indian forces had already been in Pathankot, and they had been on the Dom, I forget the name of the bridge. They were already there because of the Patiala army that already was present in the region, trying to help. And we also have to think about the linkages. The Dogra ruler was already a relative of the people, the kingdom in Pathankot. You know, all of those. There were those linkages as well. So it's a time which was very, very confusing and chaotic. And India tries to show as if everyone was trying to integrate within what was forming as India. And that's not the true story. The true story is that RSS at that time came and helped and assisted in that pogrom against Muslims to make Jammu a Hindu majority state in case the plebiscite happens. Does that make sense? So in case the plebiscite happens, now you have a Hindu majority state. Many of the people fled to Sialkot and moved on to what had become as Pakistan, and also to Azad Kashmir and other places. And it's really tragic that people like me who were growing up, we didn't know these histories. We didn't know about the Jammu massacre. It really became a footnote in the history. But when you think about the Jammu massacre, everything changes. The fact that India is a secular state trying to imbibe Kashmir into its geobody because it wants to become secular is really busted at that very moment, because you're creating this narrative that we also have bought because they have taught us that history. You know, when Kashmiris in the 70s, in the 60s, and in the 80s and 90s, and even now, the kind of history we are studying is Indian history, is the Indian narrative of how they see their freedom struggle. And that's where they kind of annihilate all other struggles into their struggle, as if other struggles didn't exist. So I think that's what we need to kind of go back to and think that RSS is not 2014 issue. RSS is not 1991 issue. RSS exactly is a 1947 issue. It began to show its teeth and fangs right at the time when India takes its first breath as India. So that's something we have to consider. We have to engage with history. Without that, I don't think we can make sense of our struggles. There are a lot of people, I know a lot of, Punjabi friends and even Kashmiri friends who are like, what really is happening? What really is the beef here? How are we, and we have to kind of engage with the notion of what India has been from the very moment to our peoples, and how it has tried to corner us and then say you're wrong, and then say, how there's this dynamic of oppressor and oppressed happening here. And it's also being invisibilized because they're using democracy as a weapon. Democracy is not a democracy inside Kashmir, if I look at from that vantage, as I already said. So now you talked about the liberal secular kind of the rubric that India has. Now, when we think about the Jammu massacre, we think about Nehru at that time. What was he doing? What were the secular people thinking about? So they actually knew that this pogrom was happening, and they kept quiet. And they tried to, and the emergency administrator at that time, who was really considered as a visionary by Kashmiris, but in hindsight was the biggest client politician. What was he doing at that time when the Jammu pogrom was happening? They were all in cahoots because Nehru said this, and it's in history books. It's on record that he said, when he was asked about Kashmir, initially he promised Kashmiri's plebiscite in Lal Chowk, which is like the central square in Kashmir. He told them that you will do what you want. You will go with any country that you want to. And we have to remember that plebiscite only has the option of 2 countries. It doesn't have an independent option. And that's again, limiting very as well. So, but then when the autonomy happened in 1949, when the Article 370 was accepted and it kind of like became a law and an article within in Indian constitution, Nehru there was a lot of clamor from people from, RSS was banned for a long time, but people who were from different, who were from that extraction, the RSS extraction, they opposed Article 370. That is part of the BJP manifesto, right from the whenever it was founded in 1984 or something like that. The manifesto is that they have to do away with Article 370. That's from the word get-go. At that time, how does Nehru quell those forces who are saying that Kashmir should not be given autonomy, who are the Indian forces? He tells them that it's only a matter of time that this is going to go away. We are going to slowly erode the autonomy. And by the time so because they realized that Kashmiris were hugely nationalistic, it's going to be very hard to integrate them the way they had done with the rest of the peoples in British India. So that's very important for us to understand that it's not only a neo-religious ethno-nationalistic project, it's also been India's secular project to imbibe and forcibly integrate Kashmir. And the other thing that I also want us to think about, whoever is listening, we have to engage with history and the words that we're using. When we say India, we also say India as if India existed before 1947. And that's also given a lot of fuel to India as if it's existed uninterrupted from 5,000 years. I think that myth has to be busted, that this was not this, it's a civilizational thing. It's not a national thing. It's a religious thing, when we think about even the name India. So we have to, like when I speak, I really want to, it becomes a little burdensome, but I want to say British India and princely states, because that's what existed before 1947. Now the India that wants to hold on to itself right now, it's a colonial entity. Same goes for Kashmir. I'm not being lenient here and saying the entire body of Kashmir from Gilgit-Baltistan to Jammu to Ladakh, again, is a British colonial entity. They created this entire state and then sold it to the Dogra warlord in 1856. Kashmiris were sold en masse with the territory as for 75,000 Nanak Shahi rupees. That's how Kashmiris were sold in 1856. And then the British were also promised some shawl from some goats, some shawls. That was also in the treaty. That's called the Treaty of Amritsar. It's one of the most tragic land deed sales in the entire history, where not just the land was sold, but the people alongside were sold. So Kashmiris till 1947, essentially till that monarchy ended, were living in indentured slavery, especially the Muslims. So we have to engage with all of that to kind of know that India has been, like Kashmir is not part of India's secular project. It's actually part of India's communal project. And for that, we have to pay attention to the terms that we're using, the way we are referring to India as an entity before, as it existed till 1947. So that for me is very important. The vocabulary is very important because the violence of language that has been done to our people is what also perpetuates it in the current moment. So that has to be decolonized, and we have to unpack and unfold that and ask questions.
Professor Ather, you've written significantly about the resistance to enforced disappearance in Kashmir. Can you talk about the role of state violence and enforced disappearances in the state's counterinsurgency policy, and what kind of resistance this has invoked as a response?
Mm-hmm. So for that, the enforced disappearances, they're nothing new to Punjab because it happened in Punjab first. And in Kashmir, there were doing, they were burying these bodies, they were putting them in mass graves. In Punjab, they actually burnt them. There was no evidence left. And Cynthia Mahmood is one of the anthropologists, a scholar who has worked extensively on Kashmir, and she's written, on Punjab, and she's written this wonderful book that also got me chapters in a book. It's called Death Squad. It has several chapters that really pertain to the struggles, and that really initially got me interested in thinking about enforced disappearances, not just in Kashmir, but how it's been used as a state policy in Punjab as well, and how that is invisibilized. So taking that parallel to Kashmir, Kashmir has about 10,000 plus disappearances, and these are mostly non-combatants. These are not combatants only. And there was a paper written, it was an open domain paper, but it's not available anymore in open domain. But it actually did a survey of the men who have been disappeared, and most of them were bearded, which means that they looked particularly Muslim. It was a certain kind of body that they were looking for and disappearing. And most of these are men. And one of the dangers that I think happens when we talk about human rights violations only and Indian state terrorism is that many people think it's a human rights issue. But, anytime we speak about a human rights issue, either in Punjab, either in Kashmir, we have to really, really foreground it, or we have to make primary the fact that these are political disputes from which the human rights violations arise. So human rights violations are not happening in a vacuum. Why are they disappearing Kashmiris? Because Kashmiris are asking for something that India doesn't like. That's why they're disappearing them. Why are they repressing Kashmiris? That's because Kashmiris demand the right to self-determination. So it's not happening in a vacuum. If tomorrow the human rights violations go away, will Kashmir issue go away? I don't think so, because Kashmir is a political dispute. So I think it's really, we are at a juncture as a people where we want solidarity based on the politics that the political dispute that we are, and not just on the human rights violations. We get a lot of friends who want to throw their weight behind us and say, oh, you're being killed and you're being disappeared and you need help. But the moment it comes to the fact that we want either independence, or some people want to go to Pakistan, accede to Pakistan, it becomes less of a solidarity because then other things also come in. So I wanted to foreground this answer with this particular thing, that we cannot lose the forest for the trees or trees for the forest. We have to really pay very nuanced attention to the kind of issue we're speaking about. Now, coming to human rights violations, the majority of human rights violations started in 1989 itself, when the Indian Army was given a complete authority to do whatever it can do inside Kashmir. And how did that happen? It happened through the Armed Forces Special Forces Act, which is part of the and that should also kind of introduce you to the colonial heart of India. That by Indian scholars has been called as part of the colonial constitutionalism that is still present in India, which allows it to become dictatorial, even though it calls itself a democracy. So if you think about the states in the Northeast, they have had AFSPA imposed on them even before Kashmir, I think. And they have had, because they have been restive as well, they have been agitating and having resistance against India for the longest time. So that translated to Kashmir as well. And AFSPA is the Armed Forces Special Forces Act. It's called AFSPA for short. It's AFSPA. So AFSPA was imposed in 1991, and it's imposed only after you declare a state has failed to govern itself, and the state machinery fails. What does that say? That from de facto, like if you have AFSPA in the region, imposed on the region, and the region is also considered as disturbed area, because first you have to declare the region disturbed. So you do Disturbed Area Act. That's what the Indian law proposes. And then you do the AFSPA. So both of these laws are prevalent in Kashmir, and they're very draconian. So by the dint of the fact that army is suspicious, it can shoot you, it can kill you, it can disappear you, it can maim you, and no one is held accountable. And that's what's happened till date. So all the grave human rights abuses that army and the government militia, other forces, and the militarized Jammu Kashmir police has done, that has been under the rubric of AFSPA because it's protected by that law. And the army calls the AFSPA its holy grail. It calls it its sacred book, and it says that it cannot operate inside Kashmir without that law. What does that mean? What does that even say? That says that we need the license to kill. And that license to kill has killed many Kashmiris, both combatants, non-combatants, and it's also allowed India to use disproportionate forces against the protesters. So I think that's where the disappearances come in. In the 90s, it was one of the major ways in which the state was punishing people. It was disappearing them. But then the techniques changed. Like in the 90s, it was the disappearances. Then came the 2000s, where you had the start of pellet guns, and people were being mass blinded. By the time it was 2010, people were actually mass blinded. And by the time it was 2016, you had so many mass blindings inside Kashmir. And then, of course, not just disappearances, you had rape was used as a weapon of war, and many Kashmiri women, we don't have any numbers because not all women report this, but there are some major cases that tell us how grave the problem is. So then you have all those, and then you also have fake encounters happening. So disappearances that I majorly worked with was, for me, it became a window to speak about the political dispute of Kashmir, not just what happens, but it allowed me to speak about the political disappearance, political dispute, human rights violations, but then also the resistance that is offered by Kashmiris. And how does that resistance look like? So now resistance always is not like armed resistance, like India wants to tell the rest of the world that everything is normal inside Kashmir. So that book actually tells you how resistance is an everyday fact of life, how it's cultural for Kashmiris, how resistance has become part of their very DNA, and how do they resist in small ways because there is so much repression. Today, as we speak, I'm able to speak because I'm in the West, but if I was back in Kashmir, there is so much silencing that has been done. Even censorship has been institutionalized inside Kashmir. Journalists can't write what they want to write. So that book and the work on disappearances, while it talks about disappearances, while it talks about the state terrorism that has happened and that is happening, it also gives us a chance to ask a simple question. How is it possible that a country can call itself a democracy and still disappear people and still kill people? Like, what is the problem here? So I think for international audiences, that question becomes interesting. It kind of like makes them want to know more. And that more is that Kashmir is a political dispute. It is a neo-colonial issue. It's not a post-colonial issue. It's a neo-colonial issue. And that's something that we need to consider when we are thinking about human rights violations as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that response. It's incredibly powerful. So moving the discussion forward slightly, when we look at the struggles that exist within the confines of the Indian state, in the Northeast, in Kashmir and Punjab, we see these clear patterns in terms of how India deals with dissent and self-determination through repression and state violence. And it makes insurgency necessary because India completely eliminates any space for democratic organizing or any space for people to even frame conversation around their liberation. And it represses these movements through genocidal violence. And it's almost as if India as a colonial project has perfected this model through its experience, through the continuation of colonial violence, of the structures that India adopted and made its own and rebranded and repackaged. And so when we look at these respective movements, we've seen how they've been dealt with by India and by us conceptually as separate silos. Can you talk about the need for the abolition of India itself as a project that requires our collective participation for our collective liberation? Is it possible to have a free Kashmir, Punjab, Nagaland as long as India continues to exist as a political entity?
I think the answer can be very simple and very complicated. Complicated because we are living in a world where you have these right-wing governments on the rise and how they are really throwing their weight behind India because India is a huge market, so to speak. and the neoliberal policies that are also unfolding in India at the current moment and have been unfolding since 1991, majorly so, because till that point in time, India was not as the liberalization that started in 1991 or the neoliberalization that started. I think that's that's an important moment to kind of flag and start thinking about, like, what has India become, and how did it unfold, and how is it unfolding at the current moment. And this also brings me to think about the farmers' protest that's happening, and also think about the Narmada Bachao Andolan. All of those things, these are intertwined, and we cannot, it's very important for us to understand a couple of things here. And I'm not trying to say that I'm not trying to look kindly at India, at the kind of vicious force it has become. But we need to understand that India is not only its own project as a country, it's also a Western project. It's a Western neo-colonial imperiality at work. They want that market. They want that ethno-nationalism there. West is the first to kind of like admonish the third world, but we also have to see the linkages that really fuel powers like India and have fueled it as post-colonial nations, thinking about them as democracies, but they essentially work as fascist states in different pockets and deal with dissent in that manner. So we also have to kind of draw that linkage with neoliberal states. We have to draw those linkages with the powers maybe that sit in Britain, that sit in the US, that want that market. Let me give you an example why I'm looking at this linkage. So India needs to open up Kashmir. It needs to extract whatever Kashmir has to offer, because it has created that kind of an economy where it has to suck people's blood. It's not giving power to people. That's not how the model is, because neoliberal model is not a model where you have people doing their own thing and subsisting. It's a capitalistic market. It's a capitalist modernity that we're all looking for. And here I will flag one thing, and that might kind of talk to all of that. How did it become so easy for the rest of the world to see Kashmir being stripped of its autonomy, even if that autonomy was a coercive thing that was done between the client politicians and India? India spoke in the language of development. It said to the world that this autonomy is really an impediment to the development of Kashmir. And then they used another word that the neoliberal economies really like, which is gender discrimination. They said the autonomy is gender discriminatory, and we are trying to do away with these. And it's also facilitating terrorism. So these three things should really tell us, the kind of linkages that we are looking at, and the kind of neo-colonial project that India is. India is not a post-colonial nation. I think that's what we need to really underline. It's a neo-colonial project, a Western neo-colonial project. So they need all of these, and I sometimes think of it as a contraption. They need this contraption because it needs the market, and it needs to open up all the markets. What's happened to the farmers in Punjab, even through the Green Revolution, the little bit of prosperity it brought, and then the ruin it's bringing. And that's how I feel like at this present moment, it needs the market that Kashmir is. It needs its extractive economy to go into Kashmir, to open it up, and that's what it's telling to the rest of the world. It's saying we're developing it. So there is a critique of development, the way the development is happening inside Kashmir at the moment, which is disenfranchising, dispossessing local peoples, and giving the rights to outsiders who are connected with the corporations. So that's essentially what's happening inside Kashmir. It's a new market, basically. And it's kind of packaged within this ethno-nationalist debate and ethno-religious debate. Ethno-nationalist rubric, not debate. That's how BJP packages it. And that's why we see when BJP packages it as a Hindu issue, as a Hindutva issue, that it's for the pride of India and we want to make India a great nation. But at the same time, you kind of see the shadow corporations that are running, literally fueling what Modi and his henchmen are doing. So I think those linkages are very important. Like, how does Kashmir how does Kashmir link to the neoliberal economy that India is? And that also tells us the tale of how India is a neo-colonial project. It's not a post-colonial project. It's not a country in that sense. So then also this, the other aspect of this conversation that we're having is, like, how is India able to hold so many such dissent together, and how is it able to hold the center? Of course, not without the geopolitical support it's having. We also have to look at different linkages. Like, let's think about what's the relationship between Israel and India at the moment, because Israel is such a brazen settler colonial project, and India is also unfolding its settler colonial project in a most brazen way inside Kashmir. What are the linkages? So those geopolitical linkages are very important. And people like to think that maybe, Modi and Netanyahu are the ones who are kind of forming these linkages. That is such a delusion, because it was in the 60s itself that India, while it was supporting Palestinian state, India actually recognized the first consulate of Israel. And it has had diplomatic relationships. And now it's doing big time arms trade deals. The pellet guns that are used inside Kashmir and that were used on the farmers, the tear gas that is produced, that is manufactured in Israel. So those linkages are very, very important. Like, who is the economic linkages, especially through the neoliberal order. And neoliberal order does translate into having big countries, big democracies that will extract more and more. But the conversation that we're having right now and the kind of solidarities we're looking for, I think we are really talking about decentralizing, and we are talking about people power. We are talking about solidarities that can emerge, because I don't think a futuristic world can support big countries, especially contraptions like India. I feel that the way the ecological disasters that are happening, Kashmir is an ecological disaster waiting to happen. Farmers are already talking of the ecological disaster that has happened in other parts of Kashmir. And then you have the states, the sister states in northeast of India. Then you have other, and we also call them insurgencies. We also have to understand that there are people, the Dalits, Adivasis, and all the other Bahujan people who have gotten together who actually are fighting for their sovereignty. That has also been narrativized by India as if it's an insurgency against the government. But those people, many of them are not even Hindus. They are from different traditions altogether, and they are being subsumed under the Hinduism category. I think those are things we need to think about. I'm not sure if I answered the exact question you asked, but I do want to speak to the neoliberal element, the connections with the West, because we don't want West to just come and admonish us. We want to tell the West that this is how it's happened. And I think we are at that stage of decolonizing knowledge, not just decolonizing it when we think about India, but also how West has influenced and West has actually done what it has done in the subcontinent, and how it's unfolding for people like us. Those linkages have to be illustrated, they have to be explored and talked about.
Thank you so much, and you spoke to the question very powerfully. Just a very brief rejoinder before we move on to the next question from Gurnishan Reed. I'm speaking specifically to like abolition. Like, we identify what India is. We know what this structure means for us. How do you then view possibilities of resistance with India remaining intact? Can you speak to this idea that, must India be abolished completely for our liberation to even be a possibility?
Well, I think it's happening world over. India might not be the only country to kind of like start thinking about not having this big contraption of a country, which it has to pull together, and it has to create a section of people that is known as this demonized other, be they Muslims, be they Dalits, be they Sikhs. I think that kind of conversation is happening world over. And when you think about this abolition of big, I think that's something we are looking at. I mean, think about Yugoslavia. We have 7 nation states right there, or 6, 2 are kind of using the common governance over a region. But I think that's what happens. Unity and diversity is fine till a point where you're respecting people's diversity, but it's also about annihilating people's history. And I think that's what's happened across India. They have created this amnesia. The Indian independence movement is such a romantic thing for everyone, whereas it doesn't hold the same sway for people in the South. It doesn't have same sway for people all across Punjab. It doesn't have the same sway in Kashmir, but it has been created as a narrative. And I think that narrative is being questioned. And I think people are asking those questions. There are linguistic distinctions inside India, which they're trying to deal with by saying Hindi is going to be the preeminent language. And I think they are going towards, when you hold the center so tight, the way it's happening in India right now, you kind of are thinking about a future where it might not be holding as strongly as it is. It might become weaker, and then it might try to find a solution for itself. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that the world is changing towards people democracies. I think we're already having those conversations. And there might be, I think one of the biggest one of the biggest frame shifters is going to be environment. It's going to be ecology. And most of the states in India right now are crying because they are ecological disasters. And that is going to push the debate further. So I think even if the neoliberal forces at this present moment kind of predict that this is going to be a contraption of a country holding the center together and pulling these people together, but the way as an academic I look at it, I look at the movements that are happening here in US, in this settler colonial state, and the indigenous movements that are happening for sovereignty of peoples. I feel the odds are in favor of people who are seeking that we have smaller principalities and not big nations. And India also needs to think creatively. So I don't know if it's going to be something major of a balkanization, what that is going to look like, or it's going to be an amicable federation that's a federation of I don't know, like a South Asian continent kind of a thing. So I don't know how it's going to look like. But as of now, thinking about India, the way it's looking at it as the country, I want to draw your attention to one of the poems that an army man several years ago, I'm writing a paper on it, but the edited volume is not published yet. But there is this poem that one of the preeminent Indian poets of Veer Ras, that's a form of commando poetry that they write. So he speaks. So this army personnel, he is speaking. He is rendering that poem while he's talking, while he is at some gathering of other army men, and in that he talks about going up till Pakistan and then going up till Afghanistan. So you kind of see the entire political project that it doesn't stop. It's an annexation project. That is at the moment really, and why did I invoke a poet and not a political scientist? I think poets are far more attuned to what the people are thinking, and that is really the heart of what Indian neo-colonial project is. He speaks about going, he speaks about Pakistan, the enemy, invokes Kashmir, and then ends in Afghanistan, having his eyes set on conquering of Afghanistan, because that's part of the mythical land. Does that make sense? So I feel like at the moment, India is really thinking about conquering, and but the way it's holding on to its center, there is nothing else but some sort of decentering and kind of just being the principalities it was before. And I hope that it's an amicable project. It's not the violent project that people think about it, but that's how it links together in my vantage, at least.
Given what we're talking about right now, we're going to jump to one of the audience questions that connects a little bit with what you were saying. So one of the members of the audience have asked, where does Kashmir stand in the imagination of a confederal arrangement of the South Asian nationalities? Is this idea of confederation meaningful and viable?
You mean the thing that I talked about, like having these principalities? Is that what the confederal arrangement of South Asian nationalities means? Well, it could be like, how it was before. I mean, before 1947, everyone had of course, there were monarchies and small principalities, and there were all kinds of satraps and stuff like that. Of course, that's going to change. It's going to be more provincial democracies where it's people who are kind of having charge of their own indigenous resources and their territory. And that's how I see it, and that's how Kashmir is going to. And I know that there's a lot of Islamophobia around Kashmir as well, which has really gained momentum post 9/11. And whenever early on, Kashmir was not seen as a terrorism issue, but now it's very easy to label Kashmiri resistance fighters as terrorists, calling them insurgents, whereas we also have to think about in terms of rebellion, not just insurgency, not this against the government, but this rebellion against an occupation. So it's become very, very easy. So that part is there. Like when people say, oh, these are fighters that have been helped by the Pakistani army, and there's a lot of Islamophobia also going around that. And Kashmir has to really, Kashmiris have to prove their secular credentials before someone can give them their solidarity because they're Muslims. And I think that's something that we have to work through. And when I think Kashmiris are progressive, modern enough to envision themselves as part of that confederal arrangement, whatever that's going to look like, where everyone is included. I think that's where most people are going towards. If you're not pushing people into a corner, if you're not telling them you're the demons we think you are, because right now in Indian imagination, the Kashmiri is a killable body. And that killable body has a certain face. It looks like it has a beard. It also has, coal in their eyes. It has a certain set of a dress. And the reason I'm saying this is because in 2013, it became very easy for India to hang a Kashmiri man based on circumstantial evidence. And then the Supreme Court said, oh, we are killing him because of satisfying the collective conscience of India, because he was he was not implicated. He was caught in this conspiracy case of attacking the Indian parliament. And it became very easy for Indians to take that hanging, that capital punishment of a Kashmiri. And that has happened in 1984 itself. Another Kashmiri was hanged. So the reason I say this is that there is a certain Islamophobia that we also have to work through, even with people who are offering us solidarity, where we have to doubly prove that, hey, we're not going to become, quote unquote, the Sharia state. And when we say Sharia state, I also think that there's so much Islamophobia with that term. Like, what does that even mean in the most progressive sense, in the most modern sense? Like, is it so bad? So, those are conversations we need to have. But in that confederate arrangement, so to speak, this visionary arrangement, I would think that Kashmir would want its own syncretic space, because Kashmiris, by and large, if you think about just think about the literacy rate inside Kashmir. If you want to take that as a pointer, where are the women? Where are the men? And what is Kashmir doing about its other genders? So that might give you a pointer into who these people are, and how less we have to fear from them if we don't corner them, if we don't put them into a corner and then tell them you're demons and you're terrorists and you're deviants, which is what the label is for Kashmiris these days inside India.
Professor Ather, when we look at the Sikhs and Kashmiri, we see that they've had a very radical history of solidarity in the past. And talking about today, where do you see the glimpses of building blocks of solidarity within the subcontinent? And what does a solidarity between resisting communities across the subcontinent look like? And how do you think we need to move forward to solidify those ties more strongly and present a tangible challenge to Indian imperialism and Hindutva?
So I think in some ways I answered the question early on, but just to reiterate, I think we have to engage with our histories to know that we are not just a creation after 1947, that there is a sentiment that is within the peoples of having. And then how is it that a nation that was colonizing this subcontinent, they can impose on you a certain statute and say that you have to join either India or Pakistan? Like how do people take those diktats, and how do we reconcile with those histories? And I'm not saying that these are going to radically do something on ground for us, but I think not engaging with these questions is also keeping us from radically thinking what our solutions could be, and also thinking about what are, and one of the most important things that I really see arising, not just that these states are really connected in some ways, there is a contiguity that also needs to be thought about. Like, how productive could we be if there were not these barriers that have been put in place? So we have to think about ecology. We have to think about the ecological disasters that Kashmir has been locked into such kind of a geo body right now that we feel landlocked. But technically, it is landlocked, but also it is not if we think about the contiguity with Azad Kashmir. And if we think about the contiguity with Punjab, so to speak. And the reason I'm kind of like talking about these contiguities is that if India is not creating these narratives where we're made to seem dissimilar, where we are made to seem as if we are someone's proxy war, like Punjab was also considered to be a proxy war, so to speak. Kashmir is considered to be a proxy war, which is such a misnomer, which is such a misrepresentation of what these movements are. I feel solidarities, we can form a solidarity by looking at a historical determinants of why our resistances are still ongoing. So that's one. And then one of the most futuristic overlaps and collaborations that can be had is thinking environmentally, trying to use the environmental rubric, like trying to think of environmental disasters and the collaborations that we can have. And, that becomes more important because the West, many people in the West understand that. And many people in the West are really, really putting their heads together, especially as indigenous people, like how we have been robbed by these neoliberal states, how they have robbed us through using democracy as a weapon, and then really holding us to ransom, just like classic colonialism. So I think those conversations need to be had. And that's how I see these solidarities moving forward. One, engaging with our history and historical determinants and where we were as people before the India was formed that is ruling right now, the subcontinent, for lack of a better term and lack of a better rubric. That's what it is doing, but also engaging with what are the futuristic debates. And I think we need to tap into those. We need to think how we have been environmental disasters and how we are hurtling towards a future where our peoples will be completely dispossessed, and how that is connected to the extractive economy that India has created inside Punjab, that India has created inside Kashmir and is creating speedily, and how that speaks to the larger environmental debacle that is happening, and how we can stop that by fighting these neoliberal states and by creating a people's resistance as well, which is like intellectual, which is cultural, which is all forms basically. So I don't know, Gurnishan, if that really answers your question, because it's a question that I'm still thinking about. Like, how do we think about these solidarities, and how can we make these solidarities tangible, and how can we also tell the world that these solidarities are not only for the future of these peoples, but future of this region?
Thank you so much again for that really in-depth response. We have one last question. I know we said we'll finish at 1:15, and we're just slightly there on time. One last question that's come in from one of our viewers on YouTube. And they're asking, what kind of world order would emerge in a world of principalities where sensitivities of certain people are still very medieval, these people who annex in fear?
I mean, I would really want to have some sort of a pointer, like who would these people be who are very medieval? Like
my assumption was they're referring to perhaps India, because that seems to be the medieval violent entity in this relationship. But again, that's my assumption reading into this question.
Well, I would say, we have to think like the process. Oh, there's something in chat. What kind of world order would emerge in a world of principalities where sensitivities of certain people are still these people who annex in fear? Those kind of people are always going to exist, but it's also the larger ethos of the world order that will dictate who you become. Just like today, the world order is extractive, the world order is a capitalist modernity, and that's who everyone is becoming. So if the world order is changing towards local principalities and democracies that are really grassroots democracies and are not imposed democracies top down, I think people who annex in fear, or whoever is that medieval, they are going to have to, they will have to, somehow subscribe and change. And even if they don't change, we will never have complete peace in the world. So there are going to be discordance, and there are going to be some discomforts. But what really matters is what the world order is, and what the people want. And my hope is really in indigenous people across the world. And that's the conversation that I've been seeing getting stronger. There is a Congress of Indigenous Nations. There is different people who are coming together and having these conversations and talking about these big, quote unquote, democracies, which are basically violent, which are the main constitution of these new democracies is violence on indigenous people and violence on environment. These are both related, and both are connected to the Western patriarchal model, basically, which we have taken on because colonialism was so hegemonic and still is. So I think we are going to go the way, when that vision unfolds and when that's going to happen, I think it will be the larger majority which is going to decide how everyone kind of works within that new rubric. And I don't really see that as a utopia. I think the world cannot sustain the way these big countries are running. The environment, the planet cannot sustain unless there is some kind of a miracle that's happening within these economies. And since there is no miracle, the world will have to think about alternatives. And I think we are at the cusp of that. Whether our generation will see that, I don't know. But I think we have to seed that thinking. We have to create solidarities. We have to keep talking.
Thank you so much. And before we end at this juncture, I'd just like to thank you so much for your time and your participation today, and for everyone who's joined us on Zoom and on YouTube. Ather, I'd like to hand it over to you for any final thoughts before we close out this discussion.
So mostly when I speak to Kashmiris, I say that we cannot be hopeless, because being hopeless is a luxury. Our people don't have that luxury. And our people have suffered so much. There's been so much invisibilization that it's upon us, because we are literate enough. We have kind of experienced world in different ways, which our earlier generations couldn't. I mean, sometimes we are like, why is there a generational shift? Why didn't my earlier generation speak like the way they did? Sometimes, we have to hand it over to them as well and say they sacrificed their voice so that we could get trained enough, we could get literate enough, we could get mobile enough in the world so that we could understand the channels that hold us back, and what neoliberal, we had to experience the West to understand what is happening back in our places. So that's why I say that we have to understand the connections with neo-colonial order and how that is not the future. That's really not the future. So we don't have the luxury to be hopeless. We have the responsibility to be hopeful, and we have the responsibility to engage with our history and also to engage with the future. And right now, the conversation that I'm having with you, this is engaging with the future. And I'm hoping that we continue doing this and continue seeing some effects on the ground where we see people coming together in a more tangible way. So that's where I'd like to end. Just be hopeful, keep talking, and keep writing as well, which is very, very important. Keep documenting, and also foregrounding that these are political disputes. These are not human rights violations. And these are connected to the ethno-nationalist religious project of Hindu supremacy at the moment, very, very evident. So that those linkages need to be talked about as well.
Thank you so much for your thoughts in concluding, and thank you to everybody who participated. Hopefully we can continue this discussion with you, Ather, at some point in the future as well. It was truly an honor to hear you talk about our connected struggles. So ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਇੱਥੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਫਤਿਹ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਕਰੀਏ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ